Welcome to Rivalries. On Tuesday, Aston Villa play Fulham at Villa Park. Today, I'm joined by Jack Collins. He's a Fulham fan who contributes to the Fulhamish podcast, and he's also part of the popular Ranks FC podcast. Jack, welcome back to All Villa, No Filler.
Thanks for having me, Frankie. I really appreciate it. It's good to be back.
Yep, anytime. So Fulham's form, you've been a bit all over the place recently. You know, you lost 4 Premier League games in a row, but you have bounced back with 2 wins in a row now. So what are you expecting from Fulham at Villa Park on Tuesday?
I think it's obviously going to be a tricky one. I think the form that Villa are in, the fact that this is a side now pushing for the European places, we've kind of swapped spaces from where we were, a month ago, where it looked like maybe Fulham were going to be hunting down that 7th spot. It very much looks like Villa's to lose now. So I think that there's a nice element that the last 2 wins have just reminded us that Fulham aren't quite on the beach. And it's a nice thing to have as a fan. Look, I think that it's going to be incredibly difficult to get anything out of this game at Villa Park, considering the way you're playing, the way that you dispatched Newcastle the last time you were at Villa Park. I think we'll take a little bit of heart from that Brentford performance. Brentford and Fulham have kind of been in the same kind of spaces, I think, over the course of this season, which is a difficult thing as a rivalry perspective, but it's a nice thing going into this, that if Brentford can play the way they did and frustrate Villa for so long in a game like the one at the weekend, then Fulham probably have the tools and capacity to do the same. And whilst there isn't all that much to play for from a Fulham perspective, I do think there's an element here of the higher up the table that Fulham finish and kind of build a platform to kick on, the more that players who maybe would have been inclined to move on this summer. I'm looking at João Palhinha, who everyone and their dog seems to be interested in after this season that he's had. Can you convince him that this is a project worth sticking around for and worth staying for, that another season might bring further, moves up the table, but also further kind of forays deeper into cup competitions, maybe a push for Europe. So I think in that regard, points matter to Fulham. And so you come into this one, in a vein of form which isn't great, as you say. The kind of 5 losses on the bounce did really hurt Fulham, I think, across the course of this season. But also now it feels like a team with a little bit of a point to prove in the absence of Alexander Mitrovic, with the manager back on the sidelines after all the furore around that 8-match ban and the whole thing that happened at Manchester United. I think there's an opportunity here that Fulham can just keep rearing their head above the parapet and say, we haven't gone away. And so if that's what Fulham are playing for, then it's quite a nasty, spiky game, I think, for someone like Villa, who don't necessarily, who are chasing Europe themselves and are playing a team that aren't necessarily, but equally have a point to prove in terms of where they finish in the table.
Right. Okay. And so, you mentioned Mitrovic there. How are Fulham without him? Do you think, will he be a big miss against Villa?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he's Fulham's talisman as well as top scorer. And so much of the way that Fulham play was geared around Alexander Mitrovic, not just in terms of swinging balls into the box, which people might imagine, but actually quite a lot of our bounce play in the midfield comes from Mitrovic dropping a little bit deep and trying to get the wingers in behind. He's got very good at that kind of one-touch flick over the top that allows someone like a Harry Wilson or a Manor Solomon to actually get away and cause trouble. So obviously, in that regard, we're going to miss him. The 5 losses, and the 4 of them post Mitrovic's suspension have felt, I think, a bit like that Fulham were kind of working out what to do without Alexander Mitrovic, because Carlos Vinicius came in, and whilst he might be a similar physique to Alexander Mitrovic, they're actually very different players. And Vinicius likes the ball on the deck. He's not actually that good at using his body in order to kind of win physical duels. And so in the last couple of games, we saw Dan James play against Everton and then Bobby De Cordova-Reid play in the last game against Leeds at the weekend, and trying out that kind of different type of number 9. I hesitate to say false 9 because there's far less dropping in than actually you might imagine from even a Mitrovic kind of character. It's very much stretch the defense, try and get over the top, try and link play. Bobby Reid drops in a little bit more than Dan James did against Everton. But I'd imagine that James might get restored to the lineup here and try and stretch Villa over the top in order to kind of spread this game out and open up those spaces for someone like Andreas Pereira to play within. So Fulham have struggled without Mitrovic, but I think over the last 2 games, we've seen a change, a plan B that's actually worked. And for it, I think Fulham are a better side in learning how to deal with the absence of Mitrovic.
Right, because I did see that Dan James started. I think it was against Everton in the 3-1, but didn't start against Leeds. And I see that Harry Wilson has 2 goals in 2 games as well. And I did wonder, Dan James played against Villa for Leeds last season at Villa Park under very different circumstances, under different manager, Steven Gerrard. But he did cause Villa's defence a lot of problems just with his movement. And I do wonder if Villa got caught maybe playing a high line and you got a ball in behind to Dan James, whether that might actually be a way forward for Fulham. And also, we do like to commit on the left-hand side with Moreno, a player that we've talked about before as well. And if, maybe if he gets caught a bit further at the pitch, if we give the ball away foolishly and Wilson's just there to strike on that side of the pitch, that could be somewhere potentially that Fulham might cause a few problems. Do you think that is that kind of a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it is. And I do think that Fulham are going to look to sit in a bit deeper here. I'd imagine it is that midfield pairing of Joao Palhinha and Harrison Reed, which is, not the most dynamic pairing in the world, but they will sit in front and screen a defense. The defense has been very good this year. I think Kenny Tete at right back has been, I would say, arguably the best right back in the division across the course of this season. It's been a really, really impressive campaign, and he's a wonderful one-on-one defender. And I think that that's going to be important, and that battle with Moreno and Buendia and the players who overlap down that side. And we know that, Emery doesn't use traditional wingers in the traditional sense and likes to get those fullbacks forward. That battle between Tete and Moreno on your left and our right, I think is a really, really important part of how this game progresses. It's really nice to see Harry Wilson back. It was important, very important in Fulham's campaign last season. I think he got 10 assists for Mitrovic alone, 12 assists in all. I think it was 10 goals, 12 assists, so double figures for both. And he's been absent with an injury for most of the campaign. And then when he has been getting back, he's been kept out of the team by the form of Bobby De Cordova-Reid, by the form of Willian, by the form of Nicolas Cabano, who's just come back from an injury of himself. So there's been lots of different things that have stood in Harry Wilson's way.
How do you feel about Fulham going to Villa Park and playing an Aston Villa team that are in such good form?
I mean, I think you look at this and these games, Marco Silva sides, let's put it this way. Marco Silva sides often start seasons well and then finish seasons poorly. Then they often run out of steam a little bit. And it's been one of the big complaints about his style of football that has kind of gone through his career, has permeated through different clubs. And so the changing aspects of that are important, but they're also kind of this element that, Fulham are safe. And if it had been the other way round and Fulham had started badly and then come into this game needing points to survive, I'd be looking at this with severe trepidation. I'd be looking at this and saying, this is the kind of game that Fulham just don't go and win. They're famously, these are the ones where you need to go somewhere and get points when you're in the scrap for survival, and the other team are just better than you and make it count. I think the freedom with which Fulham have kind of been given the freedom to approach games of recent times is maybe the reason that there's more hope than there would be. If this was a pressure game, I would back us to get absolutely nothing out of it. But because it's not a pressure game for Fulham, and because it's one of those ones that midweek, in the middle of a kind of difficult run of fixtures for everybody in terms of the stagnation of the schedule and the fact that there are lots of games in the next couple of weeks and it builds up really heavily, I think it's the kind of game that Fulham can look at and be like, we'll give this a go. We'll defend deep. We'll look to, to hurt them on the break. We'll look to utilize the pace of not only James and Wilson, but the kind of flourish that Willian has of beating players. The fact that Anthony Robinson can fly forward from left back into those areas. I think it's the kind of game that the longer it goes on without Villa scoring, the more Fulham will look to this and think there's opportunity here because they're going to have to chase this. I think if you were, on the same points that we were, and we were in the same part of the season, and I think the recent run from Villa to get into these spaces and get into the conversation for Europe piles the pressure onto you a little bit. Up to this point, I think you look at the game like the Newcastle game, and it still felt like Villa were rank outsiders to go and nick a European spot with the schedule that was left. Yeah. And suddenly you're sixth. Yes, obviously Liverpool have a game in hand, Brighton have 3, fine. But Tottenham are plummeting like a stone at the moment. And you kind of look at all of it and you go, well, if Villa don't get Europe now, is that a disappointment? And then suddenly, does that start to affect the atmosphere where it gets a little bit tense, if it gets a bit tight, if the game hasn't gone, particularly to plan? All of these things, I think, factor in. So it's going to be very interesting to see how how that develops in terms of the crowd, in terms of morale. I think everyone's obviously flying at Villa at the moment, and rightly so. And Emery is doing such a wonderful job that kind of is the way it should be. But I wonder if now that the kind of bar has been set and the tone has been set of European place in sight, in focus, all we have to do is kind of finish out this season the way we've been playing, does there start to become a little bit of tension on it? And, I'm sure the renew the passports tweets are coming out and all of these things. Can Fulham kind of play on that and prey on that? That's the question I would be posing to Fulham. Are you going to let a side here who have, overtaken us in this race? Are you going to let them fly away even further? I imagine that's what Marcus Silva would be saying to his players. And for that reason, I wonder if there's something that if Fulham get something out of this game, I think it's going to be playing on that.
Yeah, completely. And I think you're exactly right. Whether that pressure does start to come to the fore a little bit, we've been playing without pressure for so long. And now it's suddenly like, oh, we actually are playing for something. And we have a run in where we've got Brighton at home, Man United away, Liverpool away, Tottenham at home as well. So these are all clubs in and around where we are. And Fulham, of course, as well, who are not far off us as well, really.
Yeah.
And, squad-wise, against Brentford, you're looking at it thinking Cash, Kamara, Coutinho, Leon Bailey, and maybe even Emi Martinez on Tuesday night might not be available. It looks like quite a light squad, and I wonder if Ashley Young might go out the team for Callum Chambers tomorrow, maybe just to slightly switch it up a bit, because it's asking a lot for him to keep playing all the time, But look, he's evergreen, so he seems to be able to do it.
Yeah.
But I guess just as we come to round it up now, where do you think Villa can hurt Fulham? Is there anywhere that you particularly identify and think that maybe gives you a few worries?
Look, you've been notoriously fast starters, right, over the last couple of weeks, and actually we're often slow to get off the mark, especially in second halves. If it's 0-0 at half time, it's been those first 5 minutes after half time where Fulham have really kind of fallen away in recent weeks. So I'd imagine that that's something that Emery will be looking at. Obviously we know all about the tactical dossiers that he's prepared on where the weak links are. I think if you look at this Fulham squad, there is a little bit, at times of complacency. And actually, I think it's something that, we have in common in that Anthony Robinson will look to get forward at any opportunity in the kind of mold that Alex Moreno does. And Willian will step inside in front of him and allow him to bomb down that wing. And it does sometimes leave Fulham a little bit exposed in those areas. I imagine that Ollie Watkins will try to be on the side of Tim Ream and trying to get in behind him in order to cause those problems. And look, if Buendia can get in the hole behind Pellegrini and Reed, then we know he can cause problems. This is something that Fulham haven't come up against, and we talked about Emery's inverted centre midfielders who play as wingers before. We haven't quite come up against, I think, an overload in the centre like this, where actually you look at the two bombing forward from the base, and then you look at the two wide players who actually come inside to overload. It's not something that Reed and Pellegrini have dealt with massively this season. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what that looks like. Obviously, Andreas Pereira plays in front of them. He does sometimes drop in to make it a three at the back, a three in midfield. But actually, he's looked very tired, I think, of late. He covers every blade of grass. He didn't get a summer last year because he came straight from the Brazilian Serie A to the Premiership or the Premier League and hasn't really had that break. So I wonder if that's an area where the overloads in midfield could actually make a major difference here, just in terms of your numerical superiority.
Okay, that's very interesting to hear. Well, look, dare I ask, will you say a score prediction?
I'll take an incredibly hopeful 1-1.
A 1-1? Okay, I'm going to say, I think you might score actually, but I think Villa might just edge it. Some of it comes down to whether Emi Martinez starts or not. I feel a lot more confident if he's there, basically, than our backup keeper. Yeah. But also, Jack, you're part of Ranks FC, super podcast. Can you just tell us where we can find you yourself and Ranks FC and Fulhamish indeed online as well?
Yeah, perfect. I'm at J Collins over on Twitter, and we do a more general football podcast, which I imagine will be of more interest to your followers than a Fulham one. Ranks FC on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. A general kind of chat around football, around Europe and the world.